A loving parent doesn't allow their child to feel abandoned when they suffer, right? But isn't that exactly what the Christian God does to many of his children? And if so, isn't this experience of God's absence in the midst of suffering actually evidence against Christianity? Well, it turns out there's a major flaw here, and you're about to see it in this interview. My guest is Dr. Dolores Morris. She takes on the challenge I've described here in a forthcoming paper called Sleep Training, Daycare, and Swim Lessons: Skeptical Theism and the Parent-Child Analogy. The paper is linked in the description below. Here's the interview. Dr. Morris, what is Erik Wielenberg's argument against the Christian God?
He starts out with what seems like a initially plausible claim. His first premise just says a loving parent would never permit her children to experience prolonged, intense, and apparently gratuitous suffering, together with the sense that she has abandoned them or never existed in the first place, if she could avoid doing so. The second premise says if the Christian God exists, then the God-human relationship is relevantly like the parent-child relationship. This he takes from Christian skeptical theism and from Christian tradition in Scripture. So if the Christian God exists, then he never permits humans to experience apparently gratuitous suffering and abandonment, if he can avoid doing so. Premise 4, but if the Christian God exists, then he does permit his children to experience apparently gratuitous suffering and abandonment when he could avoid doing so. Therefore, the Christian God does not exist.
So what makes this argument different from other arguments from evil?
Yeah, good question. So, one obvious difference is it specifically targets the Christian God, which I think is an interesting difference. I actually like it. I like that. I like this move to expect Christian philosophers to defend more than just theism, to defend, in fact, Christian theism. But philosophically, what makes it different is that it looks a lot like an evidential argument from evil, but it's deductive, not just probabilistic. And most notably, and this is what Wielenberg really emphasizes, it does not at any point rely on an inference from there seems like there's gratuitous suffering to therefore there must be gratuitous suffering. This is what we call the no-seum inference. Just this idea that if at a certain point, if we can't see any possible reasons that would justify God allowing certain cases of really extreme suffering, it's reasonable to infer that there are no good reasons. So the reason it's important that this is not a part of Wielenberg's argument is skeptical theism says, look, we're not justified to make that inference. Skeptical theism basically is the claim that we don't really have access to the kind of facts that would help us to understand God's reasoning, at least to that extent. And so, as Wielenberg writes, this is a quote, because the argument does not employ any sort of no-seum inference, on the face of things at least, skeptical theism provides no response to it.
Okay, now, before we get into your objection to the argument, I thought we might say something about a couple of the premises. So I think it's premise 2 that says the parent-child analogy is relevant in this case that we're considering between God and his creatures. You said a couple things there. You said that Wielenberg supports that premise by appealing to both Christian tradition. We're taught to pray like our Father in heaven.
Yeah.
Refer to him as a sort of parent figure. But
Right.
in addition to that, skeptical theists themselves appeal to a parent-child analogy. Is the idea there, at least I've heard it in this context, look, if you have a very small child, I have 2 small children, I've taken them to the doctor to get shots before, despite my efforts to explain to them why we have to do this, they don't understand it. Is it an appeal to that sort of example that Wielenberg has in mind where, look, a child can't grasp all the reasons that the parent has for permitting this suffering, but when you appeal to that sort of analogy, you're saying, hey, the parent-child analogy is relevant in the God-creature case. Is that the idea?
That's absolutely it. Yeah, it is kind of the standard go-to analogy and as you say, like early vaccines really are kind of the best example because you have this young baby and it's not even that they can't fully understand. They just have no conceptual apparatus to understand anything like inoculation
Right.
and so they are with the people they trust the most. And ordinarily when a parent hands a baby to another adult, that adult is trustworthy. And this is the first case where you give your baby to somebody and they hold them down and jab a needle in their thigh. And it's clearly traumatic for babies. I mean, traumatic is a big word, but it's a really classic case where that child, I don't know about yours, mine are older now, but they really looked betrayed. I mean, especially when they
Mhm.
got not newborn, but later infancy, absolute betrayal on their face, like because they can't
Yes.
understand. So you're right. It's because of this. Well, how could we understand God's reasons if conceptually, relative to God, we are at best like a newborn, right? We don't even approach the kind of considerations that he would have to take into account. So,
Okay. So that parent-child analogy seems relevant in this case. So
mhm.
you don't try to go after premise 2. You don't try to reject premise 2. You're willing to be
Not
on
in this
board with that one.
paper. More recently, I have my doubts, but I mean, I guess, and I do say this much even in this paper. I think it's an analogy. I think it's one among many relevant analogies. So I do think God is in some ways like a parent. God is clearly not exactly like a parent. God is also very clearly, um, insofar as God is like a parent, we don't have to say that God is like a 21st century Western attachment style parent, right? So I do think we also have a lot of cultural trappings around what parental love looks like that I don't think really fall out of pure reason in the way that we sometimes think that they do.
Mm,
But no, I don't. In this paper, I just let that one go. Yeah.
okay.
I just think there's a stronger objection. So I focus on that. Yeah.
Okay. So for the sake of time, let's go ahead and focus on what you do object to. You do object to premise 1.
I
And I think
do.
on
Yeah.
the face of it, premise 1 seems really plausible to people.
That's right.
When you first look at it, you're like, yeah, what loving parent would make their child like when they could be there for their child in the midst of this suffering, they choose not to, and the
Hmm.
child feels abandoned in the midst of not just suffering, but what feels like to the child, what feels like gratuitous suffering. You think, yeah, like any parent, for example, with the shots,
Hmm.
even they let me like when I took my little baby in, they let me hold, like at least keep my hand on him. I tried to like look him in the eye, comfort him in some way as this is happening,
That's right.
so that he doesn't feel totally abandoned.
Hmm.
Um, if I was just like, "Nah, I don't feel like it. I'm just gonna go, like, sit in the corner and read a book or something. You all take care of it." That doesn't seem so good. Um,
No, it doesn't. Yeah. So I think you can reject the first premise without thinking that like a loving parent never has any responsibility to try to be present for their child in the midst of suffering. So when you first look at premise 1, it looks like overwhelmingly plausible. But I actually think that's because we have a tendency to to sort of sneak back in some implicit claims that are supposed to stay out of the argument. They're not supposed to be in the argument. What premise 1 actually says is that a loving parent would never, so already this is pretty strong language, never permit her children to experience prolonged, intense, and apparently gratuitous suffering, together with a sense that she has abandoned them or never existed in the first place, if she could avoid doing so. Um, I just think it's it's interesting to me that you say when you read that, it seems like you just, how could you reject this? Because I understand that. But there's another sense in which, as a parent, I feel like I read that and think, I am afraid we do that. Maybe even often. Like
mhm.
maybe loving parents have to do this all the time. And I think that if you look back through history, I mean, if you lived in a village and that village was getting attacked, that would feel to your child like surely horrible suffering, right? And if you then took off to go defend the village and were not able to stay and comfort your child or protect your child, that would feel like being abandoned in the midst of this child's worst moment, right? This is not an example I use. I do think I talk about parents who have to deploy and things like that.
Yeah, I remember that example, yeah.
Yeah, but I just think, especially if we broaden our perspectives a little bit historically and globally, the crucial thing is that this does not say unless she has very good reasons to do so. It says, unless she cannot avoid doing so. There are all sorts of cases when we can avoid it, but we think it's better not to avoid it. So, yeah, the ordinary case, sleep training is probably, I thought I thought that maybe daycare would be a powerful example, but when I've given this talk at conferences, sleep training is the one that resonates with people.
Hmm.
Um, it might be that I was never especially good at sticking with sleep training. But when you sleep train your child, for some children, some kids are fine. I have three, and two of them came out kind of wanting to sleep. We were really fortunate. But my first child, absolutely no interest, none in sleeping ever for longer than maybe 90 minutes. He just wasn't going to do it. Took forever. And so whenever we would try, and I would try the Ferber style, right? I'd set my 10-minute timer. Um, Absolutely, he felt abandoned. He just really did. And he really felt like he was suffering. Why do I say that? I mean, we know as outsiders he wasn't really suffering. But what the premise says, and by design, right, is that no loving parent would allow this to happen in the midst of what feels to the child like apparently gratuitous suffering. And there, I think, I mean, we don't know what newborns think, but infants are fairly able to communicate. And I do think many of them are pretty good at communicating that they feel that they are suffering mightily and they don't think you have any justification for being with them. I mean, in the case of sleep training and daycare drop offs, right? The not being with them is a part of the suffering. And you know that. And loving parents do it anyway.
That's really important because what Wielenberg says is, hey, you can come up with counterexamples to premise
Mhm.
one, but you're going to have to concoct something that happens rare, like really
Yes.
rarely, and you've crafted it just to be a counterexample. But what
Right.
you're appealing to are just these happen frequently
Hmm.
among, I think it's probably safe to say most parents, at least in the Western world, probably. This is
Yeah.
like most parents in the United States.
Yeah.
Many drop off their kids to daycare, many get their kids swim lessons, and many do
Yeah.
sleep training. So these are mundane, kind of ordinary cases that happen all the time.
The third one I do is swim lessons. And I really loved this one because it just came up. Like the week when I was working on this paper, a friend complained to me or was really commiserating. She had to take her children to swim lessons. Again, we live in Florida where you're never far from water, just never. If you don't have a pool, your neighbor has a pool. Children drown regularly. And so swim lessons are extremely important. All my kids are swimming by 3, which was not the case when I lived up north, but 3 feels old in Florida. You got to get that done. So she was taking her kids to swim lessons, and one of her children was just terrified. He hated it, miserable, absolutely miserable for every second of the swim lesson. And the swim instructor finally said, "Look, I know you're not trying to, but you're making it worse. The fact that he can see you is making this harder. And so, for real, I'm not making this up. He said to her, you have to hide during his swim lessons, right? And of course, that felt terrible because what he would do during the lessons was call out for her. And so now she had to hide. Um, and it helped. And he got through the swim lessons and he can swim, And okay, so how is this a counterexample? Well, okay, a loving parent would never. I'm just going to tell you, this is a loving parent. Not only is she a loving parent, she's motivated by love for her child. What she wants is his good. She wants him to learn to swim so that he is safe. So she's a loving parent. Would never permit her children to experience prolonged, intense, and apparently gratuitous suffering. Now, right away, it seems like swim lessons aren't prolonged, but I just think that's because we are adults. And I imagine that a 30-minute swim lesson to a 3 or 4-year-old probably does feel prolonged. This is not a quick moment. This is, or at the very least, we don't know that it isn't. And if we're not convinced it's prolonged, switch to sleep training, which is all night, right? But I think from the child's perspective, it probably does hit that prolonged category, right? So it's,
Yeah, my 4-year-old,
yeah.
I can, my 4-year-old says this all the time. I'll set a timer and say, okay, in 5 minutes, I'll play with you.
Mhm.
And he will literally go, "But that's gonna take a million years." Like,
Yes,
that's what he said. All the time he says that. So I know that 4 minutes to him or 5 minutes to him feels like an eternity.
that's right. And what we can't forget is that that's the perspective that matters, right? Because that's what's at stake in the premise. Because as a loving parent would never permit her children to experience prolonged, intense, and apparently gratuitous suffering, right? So what seems to them, he very deliberately uses the word apparently gratuitous because he doesn't want to have to make the no-seeing inference to defend the claim that it is actually gratuitous.
Right.
This is
Yeah.
not me being nitpicky. This is the design of the argument, right?
Yeah. And it's supposed to be a strength of the argument. Yeah.
It is. That's right. It's supposed to be a strength of the argument. Yeah. The defining feature of the argument, even. So, or one of them. So, yeah, I think it meets that criteria from the perspective of the child. Together with the sense that she has abandoned them, well, she is actually hiding. She has, in fact, abandoned. She's put him in the pool and then gone to hide. Now, or never existed in the first place is tricky. It's a little bit weird to throw a disjunctive in the middle of that premise, right? Which category do you have to hit? Do you have to hit both of the disjuncts with every counterexample? I don't think so. So I think we've satisfied it because he definitely feels abandoned. I think we can strengthen them later with ones that even include never existed, but we don't have to do that with this one. If she could avoid doing so. And then this is what's crucial, because could she avoid doing so? Absolutely. He doesn't have to have swim lessons. It's better for him that he has them, but she could just keep him away from water forever, never let him out of her sight. So I think she's loving. I think it meets the experiential criteria for him of what it feels like, and I think she could avoid doing so.
And those same features are at work in sleep training and also daycare drop-offs. So
Absolutely.
that's where the title of the paper comes from. You got these three main counterexamples. On average, we spend about 1/3 of our lives at work. That's a huge chunk of your life. So you should choose a career that is meaningful and impactful, especially if you're a Christian. We're called to be good stewards of the talents and time that God has given us. So which careers should you consider? How about the ones that are aimed at solving some of the world's most pressing problems? And if you make one of those careers your goal, what specific steps do you need to take to get there? These questions can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing if you're trying to figure all of this out alone. But you don't have to. There's a program that can help. Christians for Impact is a charity designed to help Christians with career discernment. They have over 50 experienced mentors who will pray with you one-on-one, help you map out a career plan, and connect you with hundreds of Christian professionals. You might be thinking, this sounds awesome, but how much does it cost? Well, this is the most amazing part. This mentorship program is completely free. How does it work? Just spend 10 minutes reading the career guide linked in the description below. At the end of that career guide, you'll see a link to apply for a free one-on-one mentorship. After submitting your application, you'll hear a response within 1 to 2 weeks, connecting you with a career mentor. If you're a committed Christian based in the US or the UK, especially if you're between the ages of 18 and 25, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss. So check out the career guide linked in the description below and apply today. While you're there, check out the Christians for Impact newsletter and podcast. Both will provide you with even more resources to help you start navigating your career journey today. So in the paper, you mentioned 2 sorts of objections to your objection to Wielenberg. So it's like, this is the counter response to you now. Let's just take them one at a time. What's one of those objections that you look at, and then we'll see how you respond to it?
Sure. So the first objection basically says, when a loving human parent does this, she has to have really good reasons for us to think it's okay. But the kinds of reasons that she has are not reasons that God will have, right? Human parents have limitations. We struggle to pay the bills. We face war. We are not all powerful, right? And so loving parents have these reasons why they have to make this hard choice, and God doesn't have those reasons. And so maybe these aren't really counterexamples after all.
Yeah. How do you respond to that?
Well, the premise isn't about God. That they are counterexamples because the premise is just about loving parents. And so just philosophically speaking, God doesn't even show up in the first premise. So we can't appeal to God's reasons to make these any less powerful as counterexamples to a premise that doesn't say anything about God. That's the quick answer. But more significantly, you can't change the first premise to incorporate this claim about reason without changing the entire argument. So what it actually says is that no loving parent does this unless she could avoid doing so. And we could talk for a long time about what could avoid means. But what we're trying to say here in this first objection is maybe it means something like unless she has very good reason to allow this, right? So no loving parent would do this without very good reason. But Wielenberg can't change the premise in that way. He won't want to. It's not because, I've never met him. It's not like I've talked to him and he doesn't want to do it. But the moment that you do it, this just becomes any other evidential argument with a no-seeing inference.
Hmm.
Because then you're going to need a claim that says not only does God do this, he does it without good reason. And then we're
Hmm.
right back with the rest of the argument.
Yeah, both those responses make sense, and I think especially that kind of quick response that you made there, like, well, the first premise isn't even about God.
Yes.
To me, that illustrates so well how to have how important it is that we keep track of what the argument is and what
Yeah.
premise is being targeted. Because I feel like in just informal discussion, it's so easy. I feel like that would be a common move, like, oh, but God wouldn't have these. If you're thinking of here's the argument and here's the premise that I'm targeting,
Mhm.
it really helps. So I hope to encourage the viewer, like, as you're thinking through whatever view you have, theistic, atheistic, agnostic, I don't
Yeah,
care. As you're just thinking through these things, like, try to figure out what the argument is. Try to figure out what premise is being targeted.
that's right.
It helps you think better. Okay,
It really does. Otherwise, things just get slippery. And then it's
right.
too easy to accidentally kind of equivocate or smuggle in premises that aren't there. And that if you put them there, you would now see you have reason to object to. So you're right. I think it's really important.
Okay, what's the second objection that you look at in the paper?
So when I say, look, you can undermine the entire argument by rejecting the first premise with these three ordinary, mundane counterexamples, it might seem like I'm saying, so therefore, by analogy, what we think is terrible suffering is really just the equivalent of daycare or swim lesson, right? And so, what seems to me like a second potential objection is that these counterexamples just trivialize the severity of suffering in this world, which is something I'm really keen not to do. I do not want to do.
How would you respond?
I just think, again, it's really important to keep distinct what it takes to be a counterexample to an argument and what it takes to be an entire positive response to a problem. So I think simple, mundane, ordinary counterexamples, I genuinely think they defeat the argument. I think the only way you can respond to them is by reintroducing the no-seeing inference. Maybe that's cocky. Maybe I'm wrong. He'll find some way to devastate me, right? But as I see it, I really do think the counterexamples just work against this premise. But I don't think that that means that Christian philosophers are now done talking about what I think really is an interesting and compelling and challenging and important part of Christian theism, which is the truth of his premise four, right? So one of the things I love about Wielenberg's argument is premise four of this argument is indisputably true, and I don't think we talk about it enough, or I don't talk about it enough. I'm trying to talk about it more. Premise four is where he says, if the Christian God exists, then he does permit his children to experience apparently gratuitous suffering and abandonment when he could avoid doing so. I think that's true, especially if we keep avoid to mean literally. God could have not created. At least a lot of people think he could have just not created, that he created freely, right? Um, the God that Christianity preaches is a God who seems hidden to people often and often when they're suffering. And Wielenberg gives really minimal defense of this premise, but I think you could go hard with it because it's pervasive in scripture. Um, Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken? Right? All sorts of outside of scripture, spiritual leaders that people look up to, C.S. Lewis, Mother Teresa. This is a really well documented phenomenon. Um, and so, sorry, to wrap up the kind of response to the second objection, I don't think it minimizes or trivializes suffering to say that trivial instances of suffering can be a counterexample to the first premise, and that logically that's all you need for the argument. I do think it's problematic if Christian philosophers stop at the defensive and don't go forward in a more proactive approach. There's an expression I love. Elizabeth Hall, I think is her name. She was a psychologist at an interdisciplinary conference I went to. And she just said at one point, I feel like we need a theology of tension, right? And I really like the idea of trying to construct that this is something people do. I know that it's something people do. I'm trying. It's less common in analytic philosophy, I think, and I'm trying to bring more of it in. But this idea of saying, okay, we can defeat the argument, right? We don't have to worry. Christian theism has been saved, but we should think about this, and we should maybe say more about it because it is interesting and puzzling.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I know that there's a, a view that is out there. I don't have a sense of exactly how widely held the view is, but this kind of like anti-theodicy, like any time that you give any sort of theodicy,
That's right. Yeah.
you're actually diminishing the suffering. It makes everything worse. So you just shouldn't
Hmm.
even try to give a theodicy.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how pervasive that is, or thoughts on that kind of anti-theodicy stuff in general.
It's always hard to know, I think, how pervasive these things are because we all interact with the people we interact with, right? So it feels fairly pervasive to me, but I don't know if that's just some of the circles I run in. I have been convinced that we way overshot the mark there. Um, I think theodicy can, of course, be damaging and has been. I mean, I think theodicy misapplied, right, has been damaging, but I also think it's immensely helpful. For me, it was immensely helpful in my life, just transformatively helpful. So I have always been a little bit wary of being too strongly anti-theodicy because for some of us, just knowing um, that the kind of existential suffering isn't logically devastating for Christian theism, that was huge for me. That was really important for me. But part of what has more recently bolstered that belief is just reading Todd Billings, the work of Todd Billings, and meeting him at this conference. And that was really kind of a pivotal moment for me. It's actually turned out to reoriented much of my writing for the last year or two because he has this perspective of being a Christian and a theologian who is suffering and in varying degrees is likely to be suffering every day of his life, which is likely to be shorter than the average life, right? He lives with chronic incurable cancer and with some chronic pain, some of which is permanent side effects of some treatments that he's had. Um, and he has this one fleeting this moment in his book, The End of the Christian Life, um, where he talks about what it's like to tell a friend who's kind of familiar with chronic pain, or at least with people who have it. She asks how he's doing and just how different that feels from somebody who's relatively just healthy and happy, right? And
Mhm.
that his pain is kind of an affront or an offense to healthy people sometimes. And he's really gentle about this. He's not critical, right? Um, but just when he expresses his appreciation for a friend who can see his suffering and not kind of overreact to the horror of it. When he talks about meeting this friend who has a little bit more shared experience, he writes, Lisa had seen chronic pain before and she was empathetic, but she wasn't scandalized by it. In contrast, when a friend responds to my ongoing pain as a terrible affront, my life feels diminished. The outrage seems to imply that this wound could never be a part of the good life. Um, that just really landed for me. Christians have got to have a conception of flourishing that allows for somebody like Todd Billings to be living a flourishing life, right? Now, he does. He immediately goes on. He says, maybe it's exactly right that my life is diminished, right? He's very clear. Nobody would choose that kind of suffering. That's really obvious, right? But when we refuse to look for any good things that God could be doing in suffering, when we um, when we allow the kind of abusive use of theodicy to steer us away from talking about redemptive suffering at all, I actually think it's suffering Christians that are likely to hurt the most there,
Mm.
or at least some of them.
If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like. And this video should just be the beginning for you. I've actually created a 4-part crash course on the problem of evil. It's completely free. You can watch it right now. Just click right here. Go ahead. You know you want to.